Welcome back to Canon Law in Exile. This is our video 3. We still are in lesson 6 on penal law, so we will continue. Right now we are going to talk about the cessation of penalties, how penalties stop, how they cease. That's what we're going to talk about now. Another word you're going to hear a lot in this context is about the remission of penalties, or how penalties are remitted, or the bishop remitting a penalty. You also will hear about absolving penalties. I probably usually myself will talk about lifting penalties. There's some precision in the language. Some people will say if it is a ferende sententiae penalty, it's more proper to speak of remission, whereas with a late sententiae penalty, it's more appropriate to speak of absolution. That's true. However, it's hard to it's hard to always be consistent with that language, and sometimes we're going to want to talk about lifting penalties as a whole. So anyway, just so you know about my usage, I'll probably usually talk about lifting penalties. This is going to be one of our more important things in this lesson that already is quite important since it concerns penal law. But what's very important is because most of you are planning to be ordained to the priesthood, and needless to say, you will be hearing confessions. What this lesson includes is when can you, as an ordinary priest confessor, lift a penalty. Don't mean ordinary in you're just okay at your job. Obviously, no graduate of St. Meinrad is ordinary in that sense, but ordinary in the sense of you are not the capital O ordinary of the diocese. You're not vicar general. You're not bishop. You're not the canon penitentiary. So don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Okay, so when can you lift penalties? Your ability to lift penalties is going to depend on 3 things. 1, what type of penalty scenario are we talking about? 2, is the penalty a, quote, reserved penalty? We'll get into what that means. Is the penalty reserved? And 3, what are your faculties? What are your faculties? What are your faculties in the ordinary course of things, in a normal situation? And what are your faculties in more extreme situations, such as danger of death? We'll talk about those things. Okay, I said we're going to be talking about not just penalties, but penalty scenarios. Why do I say that? Because if you ask me, can I, as an ordinary confessor, can I lift an excommunication? I cannot answer that question. No one can answer that question because there's not enough information. It's not enough to know that there is just an excommunication. We need to know, what were you excommunicated for? What's the crime? What's the delict? But we also need to know how that excommunication came about. Was it ferende sententiae or late sententiae? So that's why I'm going to talk about penalty scenarios, which will include not only what the penalty is, but also how it came about. So here are our 4 penalty scenarios. Number 1, the expiatory penalty. That's the penalty mainly intended to punish. Number 2, an imposed censure. What's a censure? You know this. Excommunication is 1, interdict is the second one, suspension is the third. What does imposed signal to us? That it's a ferende sententiae penalty, not latae sententiae. Number 3, third scenario, declared censure. The word declared signals to us that we're talking about a latae sententiae penalty, as does the next one, an undeclared censure. Also tells us latae sententiae. So these are going to be our 4 main penalty scenarios. Woodall discusses another one. I'll just mention it, and that's about all we need to do with it. He says, what about an expiatory penalty? It's a type of number 1, but what about an expiatory penalty that has a time limit? That you did something and your penalty is that you have to live in a certain place on a hill or in a cave for 2 years. Well, you're lowered down into your cave and you've lived there for 2 years as your penalty. And then the 2 years has passed. So that's one way that a penalty can cease. Usually, and especially the penalties we're most concerned about, they don't usually have a time limit. So you can put that way in the back of your mind, and you'll come across it in Woodall if you haven't already. More commonly, an expiatory penalty is going to be permanent, especially the ones we're concerned with. Dismissal from the clerical state in the context of sexual abuse. That obviously is a permanent penalty. Okay, here is the main rule for our first 3 penalty scenarios. So our first 3 penalty scenarios we can deal with as a group, and here's our rule. This is in Canon 1355, Section 1. The ordinary who declared or imposed these penalties can remit them, and this is usually done by decree. So not too surprising there. The person who imposed or declared the penalty, he's the one who can lift it. Okay, can anyone else lift it? Yes. Also, if the wrongdoer pardon me, lives someplace else, the ordinary of the offender's place of domicile also can lift the penalty, but he must consult the ordinary who imposed or declared it. That's also in Canon 1355. So this is our main rule already for our first 3 scenarios. So obviously, what about the ordinary confessor who we're so interested in? It sounds like he's out of luck, like the ordinary confessor cannot, at least in the ordinary course of things, cannot lift these first 3 types of penalties or penalties in these penalty scenarios. There is an exception, though. The exception is danger of death, and this is in Canon 976, which says that any priest, even if he has been returned to the lay state, he can absolve any censures and sins. Any censures and sins if he's dealing with a penitent who's in danger of death. So in these situations, you would be able to resolve some of these penalties. Which ones? 2 and 3, but not number 1, because you're able to absolve censures, but not expiatory penalties. Why not? Because in danger of death, we're more concerned with censures. Censures, as you know, include interdict and excommunication. They're usually going to be interdict or excommunication, and they prevent you from receiving the sacraments. So that's our main concern with somebody in danger of death. If you have an expiatory penalty affecting where you live, affecting whether you can hold the office of chancellor or whatever, affecting whether you're entitled to some dignity, we're not really too concerned about that in danger of death. So that's why we're not going to give the ordinary confessor the faculty to lift the expiatory penalty in danger of death. Number 1, you're not going to be able to lift those at all, but in danger of death, you can lift 2 and 3. Okay, we're finished really with the first three scenarios, but we have one scenario left, and that's the undeclared censure. Um, the So needless to say, we're talking about latae sententiae penalties because we're talking about declared versus undeclared, and this is going to be our greatest concern here, because this is where you might be in the position of absolving penalties yourself. So keep in mind what you need to know. What's the penalty scenario? We just said what it is. Undeclared censure. Is it reserved? Is the penalty reserved? And what faculties do I have? We're going to talk more about reserved, which we've mentioned but haven't discussed. Okay, what does that mean to be reserved? What is a reserved penalty? A reserved penalty, when the code talks about the penalty being reserved, that means it's reserved to the Holy See, or what the code calls the Apostolic See, meaning that normally only the Apostolic See can lift that penalty. So not you, and as ordinary confessor, and not even your bishop or diocesan canon penitentiary. That's what reserved means in the code. Sometimes we just talk about reserved, and what the code means by that is reserved to the Apostolic See. What's an example? We've talked about desecration of the Eucharist. That is reserved to the Holy See. What is a penalty not reserved to the Holy See? Heresy. So your bishop could absolve heresy, but not desecration of the Eucharist, at least not in the usual course of things. Okay, that's our main rule, and you find that in Canon 1355, Section 2. So let me put this up there. Our main rule, we're in our fourth scenario, undeclared censures. Our main rule, Canon 1355-2. So finding out that this is undeclared censure, that's our penalty scenario. That's our question 1. Our question 2 is it reserved? Is it reserved to the Holy See? If the answer is yes, then in the usual course of things, only the Holy See or Apostolic See can absolve. If the answer is no, it's not reserved, it's heresy or simony, not a reserved delict, then the ordinary or the canon penitentiary can absolve. Okay, so that's our main rule. By the way, sometimes you'll see Woodall or others talk about either the diocesan bishop or the canon penitentiary. I think they usually really mean the ordinary. These canons refer to the ordinary. Realistically, though, you're going to be dealing with the bishop. The bishop is almost certainly going to want to address these matters himself. Okay, so as we've just seen, have I lied to you? I told you that this was going to be your big chance where you were going to get to resolve some penalties, but now here we are in our last penalty scenario, and where are you on the card? You're nowhere as Mr. Ordinary or Father Ordinary Confessor. Have I led you down the primrose path? Perhaps. What we have are a possible exception. Even though usually it's going to be the Holy See or the diocesan bishop or canon penitentiary who lifts the penalty, there is a circumstance where the ordinary confessor may do so, and this is going to be. Remember, our last question is going to be, do you have the faculty? So when do you have the faculty? Another question is, or it's related, how do you get a faculty? Well, you can have a faculty from your ordinary, from usually your bishop, or from the law itself. The law itself might say that you or that all priests have such and such a faculty. You're going to have, in this situation with undeclared censures, you're going to have probably one of each, one from your ordinary and one from the law itself, that are particularly important. So uh, let's see. Um, here's here's a little schema. Um, from the ordinary, you're going to have the ability to lift the penalty for abortion. And now, in the year of mercy, the Holy Father also seems to have granted the same faculty to all priests. I only say seems because he referred to the sin of abortion. He did not refer to the delict, but it's almost certain that he meant both. So just assume that the Holy Father has extended that to every priest. And what do you have from the law? From the law, you have an exception to Canon 1355. Canon 1355 had our main rule that it's either, depending on whether the crime is reserved, it's either for the Holy See or for the bishop, the ordinary, or the diocesan canon penitentiary to lift. But there's an exception, and it's Canon 1357. It's called the difficulty exception. And it's a very big one, and it's a very important one. What it says is that in the internal forum, now when we talk about the internal forum, uh, we usually mean confession, and that's what the code means here. We've talked about spiritual direction also being in the internal forum. Here we're concerned with the sacrament of confession. So in the internal forum, in confession, in this example, um, if the penitent finds it difficult to remain in a state of sin, to remain in the state of sin while his recourse to try to have his penalty lifted is ongoing. If he finds that difficult to remain unabsolved, then you can absolve the penalties, or the undeclared censures. Again, only if they're undeclared. And what happens? What happens then? And by the way, it's all undeclared censures, not just unreserved ones, but even those that would be reserved to the Holy See. For instance, desecrating the Eucharist, attacking the Pope. Those are reserved to the Holy See. But if they're undeclared, then you could, with this Canon 1357 exception, you could absolve those. Now, what happens then? There still has to be recourse. Recourse meaning some type of procedure to have the penalty lifted, or to confirm what you've done in the confessional. Who does that recourse go to? Well, who sends it? The penitent is responsible for sending it, but he also may do it through the confessor. So you may need to do it. And what you would do, Woodall is very good on describing this. You would sort of give an alias to the petitioner, to the penitent, and say, well, look, you're going to be penitent X. I'm going to petition the bishop, or I'm going to petition the Holy See to confirm my absolving of these penalties, but you have to come back in a month to check on the status of the petition to make sure that everything's been done, that they don't require anything else. And if you don't do that, the penalty is reincurred. You have to follow up. So how is that petition done? Woodall gives you a form letter on page 483, which is very good. And then Westman, in that handout that I gave you on about 3 days ago, on pages 485 and 486, he also provides a very good description of how you do that procedure. What about abortion? Do you have to do this procedure with abortion where you petition the bishop or the Holy See? No, you don't. Not for abortion, because you have the faculty from the ordinary and also now from the Holy Father in the ordinary course of things to absolve it. This isn't. This is not an extraordinary situation here. You've got that faculty, so you are a proper person to absolve both the sin and the delict of abortion. These other undeclared censures, though, usually they would fall to the bishop or the Holy See. Those are the ones that you're going to have to you're going to have to do a petition again, either to the bishop, say the crime is simony. That's not reserved to the Holy See, so the bishop could lift that. Desecration of the Eucharist is reserved to the Holy See. That would have to go to the Apostolic Penitentiary. By the way, that handout I gave you from Westman, he even gives you the address in Rome to write to if you need to write to the Apostolic Penitentiary. This second situation, Canon 1357, where you have to either the penitent has to make recourse or you do it for him. That also applies to if you have absolved penalties in cases 2 and 3 for danger of death. If the person recovers, then he has to petition to have the penalties have essentially confirmation in what you've done in absolving the penalties in danger of death. He's no longer in danger of death, so he needs to complete the process. Okay, final thing, just want to give you a summary and a little bit more information. This is from a 2015 book called Penal Law by a canonist named John Rankin. Most of it we've covered, but he adds a few additional things that I think you might find helpful. He says in the U.S., confessors may absolve from both the sin and the delict of abortion. You already knew that, and we also know in the Year of Mercy, apparently all priests can do that. Now, do you need to do anything different if somebody says I had an abortion? Is your formula of absolution any different? No, it's not. Your formula of absolution, the regular formula of absolution that you would do for any sin, is fine for also absolving abortion, both the sin and the delict. However, you have to have the intention to absolve both. You have to have the intention to absolve the censure. What if I forget? How do I be sure that I have that intention? What you can do, and we'll talk more about this in Canon Law 2, you can form what's called a virtual intention. And what that means is sometime after you're ordained, you just want to form the intention that whenever somebody comes to me with the sin of abortion, if I'm able to absolve it, when I say the formula of absolution, my intention is to absolve both the sin and the delict. And then periodically, at least once a year, you'll want to renew that, remind yourself, especially on a day that's important for protection of the unborn, say the Feast of the Holy Innocents, or in the U.S., January 22nd is an important day because it's the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. That's when the Marches for Life take place, or around that time. So it's okay if you haven't formed a specific intention, as long as you have this virtual intention that this is what I intend to do. But you're going to want to renew it once a year or so, kind of to remind yourself. And in Canon Law 2, we'll talk about other situations where virtual intention is important. Okay, so but what if somebody approaches you outside of confession? Can you also absolve the delict outside of confession? Yes, you can, and Rankin gives this on page 184 of this book. You don't have this, but it's in the Right for Remission of Excommunication, and I'll read it to you, and I'll sort of give you the text. This is outside of confession. This is the formula. By the power granted to me, I absolve you from the bond of excommunication, uh, or suspension or interdict, if you're dealing with those censures, in the name of the Father and of the Son, then make the sign of the cross, and of the Holy Spirit. And then the penitent answers, Amen. This is going to be a little bit hard to read, but this will give you the formula if you want to look at it. By the power granted to me, I absolve you from the bond of excommunication in the name of the Father and of the Son, sign of the cross, and of the Holy Spirit. The penitent should answer, Amen. Okay, that's outside of confession. What if you don't have the faculty? What if you're talking about an expiatory penalty or an imposed censure, um, or a declared censure outside of the danger of death, or I guess even an undeclared censure if the penitent does not satisfy the requirements of Canon 1357, if he doesn't tell you that it's difficult for him to remain in a unabsolved state while his case is pending, then the you need to find someone, or with your help, the penitent needs to find someone who is able to absolve him. So this probably will be the bishop, or ordinary, or canon penitentiary. And again, Canon 1355 is the ordinary way for remission. So you would either just send him there, or you would facilitate the communication. Again, you might use an alias, penitent X, and try to make the communication yourself to the diocese. Let's see. Okay, just to recap our exception for situation 4, where you can absolve the situation. This is Canon 1357. You can absolve any undeclared censure if the person finds it difficult to remain unabsolved, if it is reserved to the even if it is reserved to the Holy See, but within a month, the penitent must petition for remission of the penalty. And he can do this through you, through the confessor. But if he doesn't do this, the penalty is re-incurred. And you need to tell him this, or tell her this, that the penalty is re-incurred. And then you will contact either in the diocese, the canon penitentiary, or ordinary, or bishop, or the apostolic penitentiary, depending on whether the delict is reserved to the Holy See or is not. Okay, that's the end of this lesson. If you want to know which crimes are reserved to the Holy See and which ones are not, that Westman handout that I gave you on pages 481 and 482 gives you the list. A few more if you want them. What is reserved to the Holy See: direct violation of the seal of confession, desecration of the Eucharist, as we said, physical attack on the Holy Father, a bishop consecrating a bishop without a pontifical mandate. These are not all of them, but these are some of them. What are the ones not reserved? Apostasy, heresy, schism, abortion, simony, and there are others, but these are just a couple that you can use as examples, or you can use to think concretely about these issues. One more point. Woodall speaks of penalties that are reserved to the diocesan bishop. Now, the code does not use this language. When the code says reserved, it always means reserved to the apostolic see. Why does Woodall talk about penalties reserved to the diocesan bishop? You can just really ignore this in Woodall if you want, but if you want to follow along with him, this will kind of give you some explanation. I think what he's talking about is, think of a diagram. Let's say this box is the whole square. Those are all the penalties that there are. And then at the top, there's a few of them that are reserved to the Holy See. And then the rest of them are not reserved. So the whole rest of the box, theoretically, is under the supervision of the diocesan bishop or the ordinary. However, look at the dotted line, abortion. That's an exception where the confessor can remit the or can absolve the delict. So I think what Woodall is saying is when he's talking about a penalty reserved to the diocesan bishop, he means one that is not not reserved to the Holy See, but also not one that he has allowed or that the law or the Pope has allowed ordinary confessors to absolve. So it's going to be this whole red area here. This area is what I think Woodall is talking about when he's talking about reserved to the diocesan bishop. On the top, it's something that's not reserved to the Holy See, and then sort of on the bottom, it's something that's within his purview, but that has not been given to ordinary confessors to remit. Okay, that's the end of this video. The next one, either today or in a couple of days, is going to be on specific delicts and particular penalties. So we'll go through the list of penalties that are provided in the code. Thanks very much.